Now that you're a new lister, why don't we skip right to the list of tasks, the third slide in. Um, you want to be able to know when you look at a recent sale, boy, is this close to reality? Is this what an arm's length transaction, a fair market value, as we said earlier, sale would be? Or does it seem like this was overpriced or sold at a discount? Were they trying to fire sale the property? Knowing your local real estate market is important. It's also going to help you when you help us do the equalization study, um, validating those arm's length sales. You want to create and maintain office systems, stay organized. There's a lot of different tasks you have to cover throughout a week, so you want to stay organized. Accurate property coding. Your main job is maintaining the grand list and all the property in it. So again, staying organized. You have to inspect property. So working with your zoning department, if you have that in your municipality, you need to make sure all the open permits get an inspection. You lay eyes on them. Review all of the new construction as it pops up in town. You have to defend those values that you come up with when you do an inspection. You're maintaining the property maps, sometimes called the parcel maps or the tax maps, typically with a third-party vendor who produces those maps for you, but you work closely with them to update transfers throughout the year. You have a public office. You need to maintain public hours and give people a reasonable right to access your records if you're not in the office. You are the gatekeeper of tax exempt properties in some cases. You need to make sure that ones that are eligible statutorily or by vote are coded as such in the grand list, and sometimes you actually help decide whether certain properties meet that criteria.
Which I think is our first topic once we get through recap, so don't panic yet, or ever, please.
There's plenty more to learn. Remember, this is day one of your 3 years of knowing what questions to ask. You got to be able to read a deed, do a little bit of amateur title work. You want to understand what that deed is actually transferring legally, what rights are being conveyed, how much of a property, all partial interest. You want to review all of the parcels. Again, you control the whole grand list. You want to make sure it's all your I's are dotted and T's are crossed. We talked about homestead and house site allocations. We have different tax rates for different parts of a property, depending on some criteria. We'll review that in depth too. If you do consider the property and declare that property your domicile where you live. We do a portion of the current use programs work. We have to help provide the values for current use. That's the use value appraisal program, where if your property hits certain criteria, you are benefited by having your tax liability reduced by using artificial lowered use values. You need to keep your eyes on utility properties, personal property, anything special going on in your towns. It's now shuttered, but we did have some unique properties in Vermont, like the nuclear power plant in Vernon. We have ski areas. We have a variety of property types. And again, you got to help us work on the equalization study at the end of the year. That's how we balance every town's individual property assessments in a way that makes it so across the state taxpayers are being treated equitably and contributing a fair share to our shared education grand list, education budget.
Absolutely. So that's a general overview of the whole 4-day class. We covered over half of it yesterday. And we'll definitely get into more detail on some of those things that might not quite sound like we did much with them, but we certainly did touch on all of these things in part yesterday. All right. Terry did emphasize at the beginning in her first demonstration the importance of taking an oath. If this sounds foreign to you, you must complete the Lister Oath, Form 3431, which is directly prescribed in statute under Title 32, Section 3431, before you can officially do your Lister duties. So if you have not done that, please talk to your town clerk to take that oath in front of them or any other notary. Benton mentioned office hours. We know that most of you are part-time or have full-time day jobs, so it's reasonable to have regular hours outside of that regular Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. The key here being that if you do have regular office hours, even if they aren't in that time period, it's warning the public when you'll be there, that when you'll be available, and you should also have some type of an arrangement with your town office or maybe some digital records to have things available to folks when you're not in the office. And I'm hoping to be able to announce by the end of this class next week when we will be giving the VLCT open meeting law training with for listers. We did make some progress on that last evening, so please keep an eye out for that. And public relations. We work with the public probably a little more than some of us want to, but that's okay. So just maintaining that transparency and open communication when the times arise. Benton touched on real estate market knowledge just a moment ago. And again, if questions come up while we're going through this recap, please put them in the chat and we'll address them before we start with the rest of the fresh material. Did a brief overview of the current use current use program. We gave a full class on that 2 mornings last week that have been recorded and should be available on our website soon for a more in-depth and hands-on approach to understanding current use and even how to do the allocation process. The key here, and I think that a lot of folks forget this piece, current use allocation notices are also something that a taxpayer can grieve. So it's important to be in the habit and be prepared to send out notices at the same time that we send out the grievance notices, and we'll talk about that later this morning as well. I think that's a key piece that some of my listeners have missed in the past. We talked about April 1st being the effective date for your grand list. That does not mean that you must go out and do all of your data collection on April 1st of every year. It's reasonable to be doing that type of data collection anytime from the fall through the spring, when new construction is complete. And for most of us, roads are firm because we know things can be impassable for a good portion of the year. The goal here, that is, I think the example Christy gave yesterday, if someone builds a barn on April 2nd, even though it might be there when you visit the property, you cannot assess that property until the following year. So we have to do our best to reflect our inventory or our grand list as of April 1st of every year. And then we give the 13 pieces of information that are required by statute to create a grand list. And in your NEMRIC program and in some of your CAMAs, you will find these data points. We gave you a sample of the printed grand list that hopefully you have seen in your office, but certainly there is at least one copy of this document lodged in your town clerk's vault annually. By statute, this must be there. And we're just giving you an idea here with these bubbles of where you would find each of those 13 pieces of statutorily required information. We talked about the 3 different definitions of a parcel, whether we were talking about tax administration in general, the definition of a homestead, and the definition of a parcel for current use. The common theme here is that for your work, regardless of the number of deeds, if there are contiguous or properties that touch each other that are in identical ownership, they must be listed under one span number in your grand list. It does not negate at all that each of those pieces are individually saleable because they all have their individual deeds. And it also does not dictate how you value the property, because reasonably one property that is next to another property, they both maintain their own individual value, but they must be those values must be merged onto one parcel for taxation purposes, which gets a little bit tricky. We understand that. Again, it's something that was prescribed by legislature who definitely does not understand the work that we do. But all we can do is our best to meet the letter of the law. We talked about the definition of fair market value. We talked about the 3 different approaches to value, those being market and sales comparison, which is most like when you go to the bank to get an appraisal for your property for a specific purpose, like a mortgage. We also talked about the cost approach, which is the approach that we use most commonly in the lister and assessor world. We also talked about how that cost system is actually based on a market and sales comparison at the time of your last reappraisal. And then there is the income approach for those income generating properties that you could also consider. The key here being that we must be able to consider all 3 approaches to value when we're looking at a property. Again, we're probably going to settle on the cost approach for much of what we do. Then we talked about what is an appraisal and what is the assessed value. I'll pause here because I know that Christy has jumped in to class. I think I saw her. And then see if there are any questions in the chat before we move on.
I'm here. Good morning.
You're here. Is there anything that I might have missed in our brief recap on this page, Christy?
No, I think that was great. I think we'll just open it up for questions.
Okay.
There are no questions in the chat right now.
Okay. And we're at 106 folks, so I think we've got everyone back in class. Perfect. We talked about the Form 411 or the 411, depending on how your senior listers phrase that. They both mean the same thing. The form is a summary of all of the taxable parcels in your grand list, combined with some information that we're going to talk about right after we get done this recap, that are your exemptions. That form, along with a backup of your CAMA data, is required to be submitted to the tax department twice per year. We know that with the VT-PI program, that's probably happening a little bit more frequently, but statutorily, August 15th and January 15th are dates that you want to remember, because those are the dates in which the tax department must receive your 411 backup by every year. Anything to add here, Christy? All right. So again, we showed you the top of your Form 411. If you have not seen one, you can print one out of your NEMRC grand list. Right now, we can also print these out of the VT-PI program. And if you would like to see one that is relative to last year's grand list, and if you don't have one at your desk, hop over to the clerk's vault and look at the back of the grand list that's been lodged there officially. We talked about how the top of that 411 is separated by category code. So again, that 411 is providing a summary of your grand list based on each of these individual codes that exist in your grand list and your CAMA program. We reviewed all of the different category codes. There are 15 of them. We bulk them together or bunch them together based on dwelling categories, which include residential construction, so that R1 and R2, less than 6 acres or greater than 6 acres. The S1 and S2, meaning seasonal type construction, less than typical dwelling construction. So we're talking about minimal insulation. It might be on piers, but primarily if it sells on the open market, would it sell as a house that just about anybody would live in? Or would it be something that would be seasonal, like a camp, a hunting camp or something on the lake that would not be reasonable for year-round inhabitants? Does not mean that people would not choose to live there if they wanted to, but how would it sell on the open market? Highest and best use. We also talked about the 2 commercial categories, being commercial apartments, which is anything more than 4 apartments in a unit, may be valued or categorized as a commercial apartment. And then commercial in general would be somewhere that you are selling a product. Okay. Similar to the commercial is the industrial. So the commercial, we're selling a product, industrial, we're making a product. That's a good distinction to keep in mind. We also talked about the two different types of utility categories. Utility electric, pretty self-explanatory. It's going to be for electric generation or distribution. It's not going to be for those one-off pieces of land where they might just have a building where they're doing their work. That's not going to be an electric generating facility. So you may have something that's owned by Vermont Electric Co-op or GMP that doesn't fit that category, and you might have to categorize that in one of the other places. Utility other is for all of the other things that might be utility that are not electric. So we're talking about telephone facilities, water, wastewater, that type of thing. And then we talked briefly about farming. Our idea of the traditional farm in the state of Vermont is not what it used to be. So farm category really should be reserved for anything that is still a commercially functioning farm. You have all of the milking facilities, you have all of the equipment. If it's just I think it's the grandfather farm or gentleman's farm, or, my example yesterday was the bunny hay. That's where we kind of got lost. I have a town that has a 6-acre bunny hay farm that's enrolled in the current use program, but certainly if somebody were looking at that property, they weren't going to be looking at it as a fully functioning farm. Something like that might be in the R1 or the R2 category. Anything else to add here, Christy?
I noticed someone in the chat is asking what these codes are for. Anytime you have a parcel in your grand list, you have to have a category assigned to it. For 411 and grand list purposes, it doesn't directly derive value, so that's why we go through all of the definitions of the categories. There are 15 of them that are applicable for grand list purposes.
Thanks for
Deanna,
catching that.
Deanna, there is another question too.
Okay.
Where does the span number come from, and does it change when there is a transfer of ownership? And then another part of that is, what about if only part of the parcel is transferred?
Sure, great questions. The span number is automatically generated by the folks, or for those that use the NEMRIC Microsolve and the NEMRIC Grand List program. As soon as you open a new parcel or create a new parcel, it will automatically assign the next span in sequence. So all of your spans that are in your grand list are sequential. Some of them may become inactive throughout the year, so you may be missing some. But essentially, if it's brand new, it's going to get the next span number that is available in the program. We're not sure how the other CAMA providers might assign those, but for now, the majority of folks are generating those in the NEMRIC program. And we can talk about subdivision in a little bit, so we don't confuse the situation.
Okay, a couple more questions. I know it does not apply to my town, but there are some in the state. What about farms that are doing animal events, but not normal farms are? Are they not considered a farm? I didn't do a good job of reading that, sorry.
No, that's okay. So the key here is we need to put our blinders on when we're talking about category of each individual parcel. The only thing that we are considering is what is its highest and best use? How is it going to sell on the market? So if it's put out on Zillow today, what are they going to market this property as? Is it going to be a fully functioning commercial farming operation? Or is it going to be an R2, a residential construction with some outbuildings that they might be able to use for some hobby farming, right? These categories do not influence value in the least. That is a CAMA question, but right now we're focusing on how to categorize properties in our grand list so that we can be consistent for another piece of the problem, which is that equalization study that we're going to talk about later this morning, or maybe on next Tuesday morning. Anything to add there to clarify, Christy?
I think you got it.
Okay. All right. And then we do have 3 other categories. Woodland and miscellaneous are the categories that are reserved for your unimproved parcels, or maybe they just have a little garage on them, or a sap tank. that may have been placed on the property. Your grand list may not differentiate between woodland and miscellaneous. But if you do have parcels that are selling differently because they're fully wooded with maple or some other type of tree that might be valuable, you may want to separate those out into the woodland category so that you can start to see how those things are really selling in your community. Very important for getting ready for a reappraisal if you really think that that is a phenomenon that's happening for you. Do want to mention again, there is a specific statute that you will probably hear about that says you cannot value timber. So I don't want you to confuse that here. Valuing woodland differently means that you're recognizing the market is paying more for fully wooded parcels. It does not mean that you're going out into the wilderness and counting the mature maples on a property and assigning a value for that. That practice is illegal. But if the wooded properties are selling differently, again, we might want to separate that out from our miscellaneous category so that we can start to see those trends. And then my favorite or least favorite, I can't decide, is other. So other, again, is not the catch-all for everything that you do not know what to do with. Other is something that's been made available to you if you have a subset of another category that you want to capture separately. So where I see this most often used is for lakefront category or properties, because you can assume or presume in most cases that lakefront land or houses are going to sell differently than those that don't have the lakefront. They're very desirable, particularly right now. And then also condos. So whether you're in the more urban areas in Chittenden County, or you're in or near ski areas that have a lot of condos, those are two things that might be put into this other category for your grand list. It's specific to your town. No two towns do it the same. But it's something that if you see a number on your 411, that summary form that we showed you earlier and yesterday, if there is a number next to other, you want to be able to identify why they're there so that you can use that consistently in the future. Anything
I
else,
actually
Bill?
I was just going to say, I have one town that uses it just for airplane hangars. There's probably about 15 of them. So you truly can use it for anything, any one thing.
Yep, I have a town that did airport or airplane hangars, and also another that does boat slips. So
There you go.
yeah, there you go.
Newport.
I mean, you know my territory, so absolutely.
Yeah. Easy guess.
All right. And then we talked about the business personal property codes. If your town, actually, I'm just going to let Christy do this one again. She's much more articulate about it. I only have one personal property town, so.
Okay, so when we talk about personal property, we're talking about business personal property, that personal property of a business entity. So your town may have chosen by town vote, to eliminate tax on either or both of these pieces of personal property, inventory and machinery and equipment. So first you need to ask that question: do we tax business personal property? If you don't, then you don't have to worry about that piece. If you do, you may only tax one. You may not tax inventory, but you may still tax machinery and equipment. So inventory is stock on shelves, again, April 1 being the key date. What do they have to sell on their shelves? And machinery equipment is all the other things you might think of, like cash registers, desks, filing cabinets, chairs, etc. So we would get a form from them each year, filing what they have for business personal property, and it's taxable only on the municipal grand list. The municipal tax rates only apply to those. And then the other piece, which is a little bit confusing, is personal property cable TV. So this is the cable lines that might run throughout your town. Comcast or Xfinity may own those, or some other entity in your town. And those are considered business personal property. So we're going to get an inventory form each year from them. But the legislature said, yes, we're calling them personal property, but we're going to also tax them on the education grand list. So if you tax personal property, you're going to get cable TV for both education and municipal tax. If you don't tax personal property, you're still going to get them for the education tax, but not the municipal. And if that confuses you, let us talk with you. We can help you code it so that it's correct for taxation.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. And I did see in the chat there was a comment that it would be odd to combine condos and lakefront property, and I absolutely concur. The other category really should only be used for one subset, so we're not really muddying the waters there. As Christy said earlier today or earlier yesterday, there are 15 category codes that are available to you, but she would prefer that we see 4. And I know that there are others in the industry that feel the same way. So you have to make the best decision for your town. All right, and that's where we ended. Do we have any other questions?
We are all set.
All right, look at that. I was thinking we'd be done the recap in 30 minutes, and we are. All right, so we're going to start today. After I stop muting myself, we're going to start today talking about the ownership codes. I don't know who sneezed, but bless you. Okay, so they're in your NEMRC program. You will see a drop down that has the title owner to the left of it. These drop down or these ownership codes should also be available in your CAMA programs. So you may have seen them there, but for today's presentation or for this class, we're going to talk about where they live in the NEMRC program. That's what most of us are familiar with. So there are 4 ownership codes that are available to you. C for corporation, S for state residence, NS for non-state residents, and T for town residents. So you could see that it could be a little bit confusing, and you might be able to use 2 of these for one particular property. But I think we want to provide some continuity, some equity. That way it's easier for you to carry practices forward. Anything in your grand list that is owned by an LLC or a corporation should be categorized as corporation, regardless of whether or not the owner lives in your town or lives in your state. We want to make sure that those are uniformly listed as corporation. State residence is a code that you would use if they lived in your state but not in your town. Seems to be pretty self-explanatory. Non-state residence would be an owner that does not live in your state and is not a corporation. And town resident is someone who owns the property and lives in your town. Christy, anything to add there?
Yeah, so just to remember that this is not contingent upon what you did for category code. It's a totally separate question. And this is the piece that might change as a property transfers, right? It's still going to be whatever you called it for category, R1, commercial, whatever, but it may have been purchased by someone who lives out of town. So this piece might change with a property transfer return. Ordinarily, the category will not change. Okay. So just kind of keeping those separate in your mind. And a corporation can own a house. So it could be a corporation ownership of an R1.
Absolutely.
Christy,
Great distinction.
what about a nonprofit?
So it's probably a corporation for ownership. And then later we'll talk about the taxability piece on that. But most nonprofits are owned by some sort of LLC or corporation.
Do you want to take another question?
Yes, please.
Okay. What if an in-home business and an LLC, and what if it is an in-home business and an LLC and only uses about 20% of the property, one room in the house?
Who owns the property?
Yeah.
That's the question. Who owns the property? Does the LLC own the property? Then the ownership is corporation.
Right. So if it's Acme LLC owned by John Smith, and John Smith lives in that Acme property, it's still going to be a corporation, even though someone who lives in town also lives in that property. We're basing this on the deed itself, not the use of the property.
Yep.
All right. And another series of codes that we have in the grand list are the tax status codes. There are 4 options available to you. There are 3 options available to you. According to this dropdown, but sorry. So we have taxable and taxable but exempt by vote, non-taxable and state. And I do realize that we have 2 T's here. I will have to hop into or ask Christy or Terry to confirm what those codes are.
I think that was just to clarify that even though something is in fact taxable, it could then have another layer that gives it a vote that makes it exempt. So it would still be coded taxable with an exemption layer. And we just wanted to clarify that in the coding.
That makes complete sense. Thank you, Christy. All right. So if a property is liable for any tax at all, even if a portion of the property is exempt, you're going to have a tax status of T for taxable. If it is completely non-taxable, we're going to code it with N or non-taxable. And then if it's a state-owned property, even though those are also non-taxable, we're going to put their tax status as state-owned.
Deanna, can you speak to coding and tax status for a town-owned property?
So if it's town-owned property, it's going to be listed as non-taxable, unless a portion of that municipally owned property is taxable. So for instance, in my town, the post office used to rent out a portion of a town building, which would be taxable.
And the ownership code?
So the ownership code for a town-owned building would be a corporation.
Yep. And the category code is whatever it is, right? The town could own land and it could be miscellaneous. The town could have a town garage and that would be commercial. The town could have the town office, which would be likely commercial, things like that. So keep those things, whatever you would normally call them, if they were not owned by the town. What in fact is it for category?
All right, and I just thought churches. Churches are going to be non-taxable unless a portion of that church or church property becomes taxable. So the most common place that we see this is the former or the church edifice, so the church building that had a house right next door where the pastor or the priest lived, but no pastor or priest lives there anymore, and the church decides to rent that structure out. So as soon as that becomes rented, it becomes taxable because it's for profit.
And I would code a church commercial for category.
Yes,
Closest
definitely.
thing you got. Closest
Yep.
thing you got.
Okay. All right. Now let's talk about who determines taxability. So if you're following along in your document, we are now on page 10, at the very, very bottom. So listers are the first stop in the determination of taxability. When the property is in question, it's the property owner's responsibility to provide the listers with the evidence that they are potentially tax exempt. Property owners may follow the appeal process. So if they disagree with the determination of the Board of Listers, that is appealable to the Board of Civil Authority and beyond. Same process for current use allocation and value grievance. PVR does have a form available to you. It's PVR 317, which is our public pious charitable form, which provides a very thorough form as well as description of what you should be asking these organizations to provide you in order to make your determination. Christy?
So I like to think about taxable and non-taxable properties again in kind of layers. So the first question for you always is going to be, is this property tax exempt under a law by the state of Vermont? Is it statutorily tax exempt. And there's a very exhaustive list of those. You can look in the Lister's Handbook, which will help you. You can also look in your grand list for guidance to see what you have as non-taxable. So those are the pieces like churches and cemeteries and town-owned land and town-owned property. Those all have a statute behind them. So that's one layer. We can say, okay, those are the ones that are unequivocally non-taxable, except for those little pieces that Deanna alluded to where they might be getting some income out of it, right? Most of those are going to be slam dunks. Okay, they got a law behind them. They're non-taxable. I'm done with those. Then we have the taxable properties that the town can also vote to exempt by vote. So those might be like a Grange Hall or something like that, right? The town, but for that vote, it would be taxable. But the town said, we're going to say it's not taxable. So there's another layer, right? And then the third layer is this odd little thing, right? Which has one statute behind it, and it's come out of a court case that says, I think I'm non-taxable for some other reason. Okay, so property owner comes into you and says, I'm a non-taxable property. Or they might say, I'm a 501c3, you can't tax me. So what we need to do is back up and say, okay, do you have a law behind that? No, I do not. But I'm non-taxable because I'm a 501c3. So this is where we're taking you through, what would I do if this person came in? Okay, I would say, well, I don't see any law behind it. So we need to have you fill out this form. You're claiming you're public, pious, or charitable, which is what it's called, right? And we need you to fill out this PVR 317 form. And if you get me all of those pieces and make sure you get me all the attachments, then we'll have all the evidence we need to determine whether or not, in fact, you would be tax exempt under this portion of the law. Okay, it's a little, it's a little bit sticky, and we might have to sit with you and go through it for you to make a determination. They don't come out a lot. You might have one every 5 years or so, but we want you to be aware of it.
Absolutely.
And can we
Um,
check in on a couple questions, or would you like to wait?
We can go ahead and check on some questions. Yep.
Okay, what about containers? Shipping containers or containers?
So I think we're talking back about all of the category codes,
Yeah, I think so.
tax status codes, ownership codes, etc.
So I'm assuming the container isn't a parcel onto itself. The container has to be sitting on something, right? So when we're talking about grand list category, it's probably going with a house, and maybe they're using it as a shed, right? Those rent to own containers or something like that. Then it would go with the primary category for that property. So unless I'm missing something, I'm not sure what the question is.
Yeah, just the question containers. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
If we can get, yes, container
Vicky,
for coding. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
so what she's getting to then, you're not talking
Mhm.
about grand list coding when you're asking that question. You're talking about value coding, which is a different question. Okay, so you're talking about how would I value it in my CAMA, which is my value side, not what I would call it for a grand list category. And likely if it's a container used like those rented by property owners, I would call it a shed because that's what they're using it for.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
One more question. Do districts now own the schools and property, and how are they recorded?
So the answer there again, because we love this answer, is that it depends.
Yep.
Articles of consolidation that came out of Act 46 back in, I think, 2018, did have verbiage in there that transferred school-owned property to the school districts themselves. Some schools were not owned by the school district, some were owned by the town. So it's going to be a case-by-case basis. So if you have questions about that, I say reach out to your district advisor, and you'll probably be forwarded to me as the former school treasurer and town clerk and treasurer I was very familiar with that process when I was in that world. The container question is always a fun one for me, because most of us have now seen at least one container that has been converted into a home. So if we're talking about April 1st in our grand list, and on April 1st, there is just a container or two sitting on a parcel that you know they're going to be converting into a house for next year, for this year, there's no house. They're just containers. We're going to treat them as sheds until their purpose changes and they would sell differently on the market. So lots of caveats and things to consider, but remember the date of April 1st, and then we're going to look at those properties and those uses individually. All right, so on your screen here, we just have a snip from our website. There's a snip at the top of the page, which I believe is also available in your course document. It's just going to our website, typing in Public Pius in the search bar that you'll find in the top right-hand corner. And one of the first few things that you're going to see pop up is form number PVR 317 that we talked about. And you can see here at the top that there are required attachments that so that you can do your best to identify whether or not they can apply for this tax exemption.
I
All
would
right.
be really specific with them too, to make sure that they read this application and supply you with all of those things that are listed right there, required attachments. Because if you don't have all those pieces, then you can't move forward. So, just make sure, I'm sorry, but you need to provide me with all of these pieces before I can consider it.
Yep, absolutely. The onus of this is on them. They must
Yep.
prove to you that they are eligible for this exemption.
And you only need to do this analysis upon request. You're not doing this analysis out of the blue. They're either going to fit into those other categories that I mentioned or they're not. And if they're not, clear as day, then they need to prove it.
Absolutely. All right. So now let's talk about exemption coding, Christy.
So we have some other things, like I mentioned, one of those categories, right? That the property is taxable, but on top of that, there's a layer that makes a portion of it exempt. So some of these things are veterans exemptions, farm stabilization, voted exemptions, like I mentioned earlier, and current use that we talked about earlier. This takes the value that you've given the property and then gives a portion of that value as exempt so they don't pay taxes on it. Okay, and there's different coding that we'll go through for that. You can see here that where the veterans lives on your value tab in NIMRIC. And then the contract would be a voted exemption, and you would enter the amount that's exempt and then a code to go with it. The farm stabilization, very, very few towns have. It's kind of like, I equate it to a town voted program similar to current use. In other words, you're giving stabilization to farm properties within your town. Okay, very few towns have it, so you just have to ask that question if you have it. And then current use, like we talked about, and that would be the value that you would be pushing to NIMRIC from your VTPI program when you complete your current use parcel review. And then the right-hand side of that page is, or the screen, I should say, is where you would enter if there was a voted exemption. So let's take that Grange Hall, for example, and the town had voted it exempt. You would need to have a date that the town voted it, a beginning date for when they said it would start, an ending date, the statute that you're voting it exempt under, which would be required to be right in the vote wording, right? They say, does the town agree to exempt this property per Title 32, 38, 42, or whatever it is, okay? And then the next question is it approved by the state? So this would only be applicable for a very few properties. Most of the votes now are going to be non-approved, and we can talk about that a little bit more if you'd like. And then as part of that vote, the town can say, Well, we're going to exempt it, but we're only going to exempt it on the municipal side, not on the education side. So if it's not written in the vote that way, what the town is agreeing to is the town's agreeing to pick up the tab for that entire tax bill for that property. You could write a vote to say, no, we're going to bill the education tax to that person. We're going to say, okay, Grange Hall, nope, sorry, you pay the education tax and the town's going to pick up the municipal. Okay, so that's what that last question is referring to. And then same idea with farm stabilizations. When did you vote it, etc. Any questions there?
So I think I see one about veterans, and
Well,
I think we
sorry
have,
about that. I was thinking hard about that question. So
Okay.
yeah, a couple questions here. Does veterans exemption require residency or simply ownership?
We're going to go
So-
into veterans right now, I think.
Okay.
yes. Yeah,
Oh,
we don't
let's
have a
see.
separate screen,
And
but
then,
yeah.
yeah, there's another veterans question, and then a question general. How, is there a limit to how long an exemption can be voted for?
Okay, so let me take the last one first because it's relative to what we just talked about. Most of the statutes will tell you what the limit is for time. Typically, like Grange Halls and all that are voted exempt under 3840, Title 32, 3840. So that typically says the town has to exempt it first and it goes for 10 years and then every 5 years thereafter. Okay? But as part of that vote and as part of that warning, you'd want to know that. How long are we exempting it for? And so for listers, really, your job is to read that warning and say, what did the town vote? What are the dates? What is the timing? And then what we suggest you do is kind of review them each year to just kind of to help other people to say this one really needs to come up for vote. Not your responsibility, but most listers do it, right? Anything else you want to add to that one as a former town clerk, Deanna?
I just think that the ending date of any voted contracts in your program are very important for you to pay attention to. We've
Yep.
already gone through town meetings, so if you have an ending date on one of these contracts that was 2024 or say 3/30 of 2025, that means it's not effective for your April 1st, 2025 grand list, and that may become taxable. So it's important for you to keep an eye on that and give the town clerk or select board, whomever sets your warning for town meeting, the heads up that this needs to go on next year's warning to be voted at town meeting. Very important. Otherwise, somebody's going to get a tax bill. They're going to be very unhappy. They'll probably appeal. It'll become a whole process for you. And as far as the veterans, veterans require that you own and occupy the property. So if you are a veteran and you own 5 properties around the state, and you live in none, you are not eligible for the veterans exemption. You must own and occupy that residence.
Yep.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
go ahead. So let me just kind of go through the veterans piece. So a veterans exemption is allowable for a veteran who served during a wartime and was considered disabled at a certain percentage. The nice part for us is that we don't have to determine that piece. It is handled by the Vermont Office of Veterans Affairs. If someone comes into you and says, you know what, I think I'm eligible for a veterans exemption, you can say, you know what, kind of like current use, you can say, I don't know all the rules. I'd like you to talk to them. We've given you the phone number there on page 11 so that they can contact the VOVA Veteran Office of Vermont Office of Veteran Affairs, and they can speak to them about whether or not they'd be eligible. They're then required to file the form every year unless they're considered permanent and total disabled. Again, not something for you to worry about. You should just say, I think you have to file every year. So make sure you do that if you are determined eligible. And then what happens is the Veterans Office will send us being you, a list of all those veterans in your town that have been determined to be eligible. Okay. The state has determined by law that if they're eligible, they're exempt at $10,000 for their property, $10,000 worth of exemption. The town can vote up to an additional 30,000. So your exemption in your town may be as high as $40,000 for veterans. So you need to check. You can pull one up in your grand list. You can ask the question, how much do we allow per veteran? Is it only 10,000? Is it somewhere between 10 and 40, or do we give the full $40,000? Okay. And then what will happen with that list is in VT-Pi, those folks will be entered as having an exemption automatically from the lists. But what we'll have you do is go through and check that list that comes down from the VOVA, which will be in spreadsheet format, and say, what do I know about this property, right? If you know, like Deanna says, oh, that person doesn't live there. They moved to Florida. You would let VOVA know, okay? Or that person died. They don't live there anymore, right? Things like that. They have no way of really knowing that. So we need to try to help them to track and keep this list correct.
So, and there is an allowance that if you are a widow or a widower,
Yep.
that you may maintain that exemption. So we rely very heavily on the list that VOVA sends to us. And this is the first year. So those who have been here for more than a year, well, this might sound odd to you, but all exemptions are being managed in the VT-Pi program now. You may double enter them into the NEMRIC program if you would like, but there is an export that will be provided to you to get that information down into your NEMRIC billing system if that's where you're going to be printing your bills. I think most of us will be this year. But again, we want to be very careful to review those exemptions, even though VOVA has said that they're eligible, because they might not be updated, particularly for those ones that are 100% disabled and are considered a permanent exemption.
Mhm.
Okay. The other thing that is not listed in your documentation, so you might want to take a note, in case somebody comes into your office and says they want to apply for this. Their applications must be received at the Veterans Office by May 1st every year. So that'll just be a key piece of information. It is available in our other documentation, like our Lister handbook, but it didn't make it into this course document.
Yeah, good point. And also, I know this will come up. If a person is a veteran and they don't file a homestead for whatever reason, they don't know about it, they don't do it, they refuse to do it, whatever, it does not take away their veterans exemption. So they can still get the veterans exemption even though they failed to file the homestead form.
Right. This comes up in conversation all of the time. For some reason, legislature has not considered the homestead declaration law and the veterans exemption law to be mutually exclusive. Or to be dependent on each other. They are mutually exclusive. So they do not rely on each other, though the rules are very, very similar. And we know by definition, if the veteran must live there and they own it, that they are also responsible to file a homestead declaration. You can share that information with them. They may also be eligible for a lower tax rate. That homestead rate is often lower. They might also, if their income is limited, they might actually qualify for a state payment. To help with their liability. Usually it, like Christy said, it's just a matter of them not understanding. Sometimes they really just don't want to, and we can't make them do it at this point. Any other questions on veterans exemptions before we continue?
No, we're good to go.
And
Awesome. Thank you, Beth.
just one more thing. So mathematically, so that folks like to understand this piece of it. If your town has voted to exempt veterans at $40,000, what the town has said is we as a town are willing to pick up the education portion for these folks for the additional $30,000. State allows you 10, you voted an additional 30. So your town is willing to pick up the tab for the education portion for that additional 30 for those folks. So you'll have on your tax bill what's called a local agreement rate, and that's where that should show the liability for that portion.
Absolutely. And it doesn't happen very often anymore, but if the property is valued in your grand list at under 40,000 and you have a $40,000 exemption, it will just zero out that assessment. So
Mhm.
say it's 300 or 30,900, they'll get an exemption for 30,900. It's built
Mhm.
that way so that you don't provide a negative assessment on a tax bill.
Mhm.
All right. My dog is losing his mind. So, Chris, I'm going to let you talk about covenant restricted and special exemptions.
Sure. Okay, so covenant restricted housing, probably most of you might not have dealt with, or you might not deal with a lot. This is a program that allows folks to get special grant funding when they buy a house. And with that, they get, because they're getting a grant towards buying the house, they have restrictions on the property that say you can only recoup a certain amount of fair market value up to a certain percentage when you sell the property. Typically, they can only recoup 125% above fair market value. And it comes with this long deed that lays out all these restrictions. And what the legislature said is, well, because of these restrictions, we're going to allow these folks that have this covenant restricted deed, and you'd have to read the deed, right, to know it. We're going to allow these folks an additional discount from their assessment, and it can be 30 to 40%. And the way that that's managed is, rather than being similar to other exemptions, it's directly reduced in your CAMA program. So you'd want to make a note in your CAMA program and then apply a 30 to 40% reduction. And you'd want to be consistent. If you decide in your town we're going to do 30, then do 30 on all of them. Don't do 30 on some and 35 on others. It's just not going to bode well for you. Okay. We also will send a list to you of those that are applicable in your town. I'm working on getting the list now, so I should have it out soon. It'll be in spreadsheet format and show you the address of those properties in your town that have covenant restricted housing. If you don't show up on the list, then the chances are you don't have any covenant restricted housing, which could very well be possible.
And I think oh,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, covenant restricted housing is often confused for subsidized or qualified housing, which we don't actually talk about in this training. But do you want to quickly just comment on the difference there?
Sure. So covenant restricted is typically single family housing that the owner qualified for this special grant program, got the grant towards buying the house, and as part of it, they have to return some of the equity that they get, right? Some of the return that they get when they sell back to the grant program. Okay, that's basically the long and short of it. Qualified or subsidized housing is typically apartment houses that have a limited rent based on HUD financing, right? Because what they're saying is these folks that are renting these apartments have limited income, and therefore we are reducing their rent because of it. So qualified or subsidized housing is apartment buildings. And what we do with those is a special income value based on those. And we give you an income sheet on our website that's called Subsidized Housing Spreadsheet. And so we do a special calculation, and they're also allowed up to 10% reduction on top of that for the amount of units that they're using for this purpose. Okay.
Absolutely.
But it's good to know that those two things are very, very different. Different law that applies, different kind of housing, and different calculations. If you have
Right,
any
so-
questions, let us know. We're happy to go through them with you. And I will try to, when I send out the list for covenant, I'll try to again explain the differences so that you'll know.
There are
Right.
quite a few questions in the chat if you're ready to take them.
Before we go to the questions, I just wanted to also add, the covenant restricted houses must be occupied by the person who owns it. I ran into a couple of situations in one of my towns where someone from out of state didn't understand what they were buying and started renting it out. So that's become an issue. So if you
Mhm.
know that that's happening when you get that list from us, definitely let us know so that we can address that with the appropriate agency. And often you will find that these single family dwellings that are covenant restricted, the land underneath them might be owned by a land trust. So that would also be a clue that they are covenant restricted.
Great. 2 other questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, is the covenant exemption amount voted on?
No. It's your decision, anywhere between 30 and 40%. If you ask me, I would do 30.
Okay, a little qualification here. What would be a reason for a town to do 30 versus 40 reduction on a grant program property?
So I would
Uh,
say that that would be set at the time of your last reappraisal, and what was appropriate in the market at that time. Again, you want to be consistent based on what your last reappraisal was, but other than that, I can't really think of a reason. Christy?
I would just not go changing it willy-nilly, right? So if you've already done 35 or whatever, stay with that. But if you just barely have one, my opinion is, why would I give them 40? I'm going to give them as little as possible out of my grand list. That's just my opinion. So I would do 30.
What about
And-
habitat? Whoops, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Deanna.
No, I just wanted to make one other comment. There is a place in your NEMRIC program and in VT Pi that you put that percentage. That percentage doesn't actually do anything. You're going to capture that adjustment in your CAMA program. So if you do have those and you're like, I changed this percent here in my NEMRIC program down to 10%, not that we would, and it's not changing the value, that's why. This is an information field only, and that value
Yeah.
adjustment is going to happen in your CAMA program.
Great point. Great reminder.
Okay, what about Habitat for Humanity? Is that covenant restricted housing?
Not necessarily.
Read the deed.
Yep. Read the deed.
Okay, we have a property land that can only be used for 4-H. Would this be a covenant restriction?
It's not a covenant restriction, no. Covenant restriction has a specific deed with it about that funding and how it works with the recouping the amount when it's sold. So no, this is you're talking about a different kind of limited deed. And if it's written in the deed, then perhaps you have to consider it when you value the property, but it doesn't make it a covenant restricted.
Great. Comment from Jeff. I believe the covenant restricted housing is also taxed as a homestead, not non-res.
Assuming that they file a homestead on that property. Correct. Which they should, because they are supposed to own and live there. But if, for example, they forget for some reason to file their homestead, then that does not take away their covenant restricted status and reduction.
Correct, absolutely.
Last question. If a single family home is unlanded, how is it coded?
So I think if you have these covenant restricted houses in your town, you're going to find that they really are unlanded, because typically a land trust will own the land underneath. Not always, but I believe that's the most typical. So in that case, the land, even though it's technically a miscellaneous parcel in your grand list, should have a homestead value assigned to it. And we'll talk about homestead and house site coding in a moment. Because the entity that owns that parcel is going to pass that tax on to the person who owns the covenant restricted house. If you look at the homestead declaration form, you'll see that there's a section at the bottom that addresses this. They're actually going to get a credit for it if those taxes are passed on to them. If it's an unlanded house in this situation, we're going to call it an R1 or an R2, depending on the acreage that's assigned to it. Anything else there, Christy?
Nope.
I'm cooking with gas today. I love it.
You are?
Okay. All right. Any other questions before we talk quickly about special exemptions that most of us do not see?
We are set with questions.
So special exemptions, are applicable to some communities or some grand lists. You'll see that number 6 is qualified housing, which we did just talk about in some pretty good detail. You also may have lifts and snowmaking facilities in your town if you're, Jay Peak, Smuggler's Notch, any of the other mountains, Killington. Way tanks, I've never seen them, but there is a specific statute that will exempt them. So you may see this category on, or this code in your grand list. Vermont Yankee, most of us know what it is, but it is now shuttered, and I don't believe that that applies anymore. But if it does, it's only to the town of Vernon. I don't know if we have Vernon folks here. But if you have questions, please speak to your DA. And then we also have solar, wind, and some things are court ordered. Christy, you want to talk about those?
Yep. So in general, these are all called special exemptions because the legislature defined them as properties that are only exempt on the education portion of the grand list. So that's what makes them special, right? We're only going to treat them as exempt on the education portion. You're still going to get the tax on the municipal portion of that grand list. So by coding it as such, that will make it so that that tax bill comes out correctly. And the last one, the court ordered, might be something where the court said, this is exempt on the education grand list, right? We have a few of those and you can enter it as such. It's kind of, we could call it an override for special court decisions, and you would know if you had one. I think that's it on that piece.
I think so.
Unless there's questions.
I don't see any activity in the
questions.
chat. Okay.
No questions.
All right. So the next screen that we have is just how that's going to show up on your 411. But I did want to put a little bit of a plug in here. Those who have been here for more than a year have heard of VT-Pi, which has become the new statewide grand list, which used to live in the NEMRIC program. So we're still in transition with that process. Various opinions on that, but it is what it is. We're going to get there. But the exemptions piece is really interesting. It's set up quite differently than what you just saw on your screen. But the really nice thing that I found about the program is every type of exemption, there is a blue hyperlink that will bring you directly to the statute so you can read it. So if you haven't played around with the exemptions module yet in VT-Pi, go ahead and get your feet wet with that. And when you run into any questions, please reach out to your DA.
Yep, and we are going to have Pat Santoso from VT-Pi on the last day, I believe, so he can touch on that as well as any other VT-Pi issues.
Absolutely, and we'll have him show us all around.
Yep.
All right, so on your screen now, also on page 12 of your printout, we're looking at the bottom 2/3 of your 411. So everything above here was taking into consideration all of the parcels in your grand list that are taxable and summarizing it by category. And then to get to the eventual education and municipal liability, we have to reconcile all of those exemptions. So you'll notice here at the top of your screen early on this morning, we talked about business personal property for cable, equipment, and inventory. So if you print your 411 and you see a number here, that means that you have taxed those properties, okay? And you should be able to find those in your grand list for the individual parcel. We also here capture the exemptions. So we're going to capture the amount that is 10,000, which is 100% exempt for for education and municipal. And then if your town does vote an additional amount above the 10,000, you'll see that captured here. So in this case, we had 3 veterans, and this town voted an additional 30,000. So that gives us a total veterans greater than 10,000 of $90,000. That means that the taxpayer is not going to pay the tax on that, but the town is going to pay the education tax on the amount that is listed here. So very important for tax rate setting time for your clerk and/or select board. Christy, you want to talk about the rest of the form?
Sure. So then we have other kinds of exemptions that we talked about, things like voted exemptions. If you, for personal property, if you don't, this one's a little confusing. If you don't tax personal property, then you have to exempt it off of your municipal portion because you can't get it if you don't tax personal property for cable. Again, if that's super confusing, we'll help you with it, but you can, that's why you can see their PP contracts of $400,000. My eyes are having a little trouble reading that, so I guess I got to make it bigger, but there, I'm zooming in so I can see better. Old eyes, there we go. Okay. Okay, so that's why you can see PP contracts there. And then you can see other contracts. So we have non-approved and then that owner pays education tax that we talked about. So this is where you're going to see the count of your, how many you have, right? For voted exemptions and what the dollar figures are that equate to those. And in the subsequent pages of your 411, you can determine what those properties are, right? So you can correlate all the subsequent pages back to this front page. And because even though I'm not an accountant type like Deanna, I'm very anal when it comes to numbers. So I like to take all of those pieces in the back and equate it back and make sure that I know what every piece and part is mathematically. If you're a new lister, it's a good exercise just to really understand where things are located on that 411.
Yep.
And equate them back to each and every vote and each and every amount.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Right.
so you work your way through, and then we get down and we can see farm stabilizations there as well. And then we get down to current use. Okay, we're gonna have a parcel count and an amount, those special exemptions that we just talked about. And then we have partial statutory, and those are things like if the church had a commercial use of part of their property. I think Deanna talked about one in her town where the town office rented out a portion of a building, or the town rented out a portion. That would be considered a partially statutory exemption. So part of that property would end up being exempt and the rest of it wouldn't. So you'd see part of the value of that property there as a partial exemption. Okay, so when you get to the end of it, what you're doing is top portion we talked about the other day is your total taxable. And then these are all pieces that subtract from that to get us to a net grand list taxable figure at the bottom that we're going to set tax rates on and collect taxes on.
All right. I don't think I see any activity in the chat, so we will go forward. This is super blurry. I apologize. You can see a clearer version on page 13 of your documentation. And you want to talk about what we're looking at here, Christy?
Sure. Can you back up just one minute? Because I forgot to mention something on the prior page. Right down at the very bottom, and again, it's because I have to make it bigger. I can't see the whole. Right underneath those numbers, it says 21 non-tax parcels are included in your 411. So that's good for you to know when you're reconciling one to the other. Those are those statutorily non-taxable parcels. It also includes state-owned parcels. So that 21, you should be able to determine with your other reports are all things like those churches, cemeteries, town-owned properties, and then also your state-owned. Like if you have a state-owned highway garage or something like that. All of those that you should have listed should add up to this 21 if you're trying to reconcile piece by piece.
Absolutely. And I think we actually show a sample of that report after this next slide or two here.
Yep. Okay, so again, this is just a summary piece here, right? And the first questions here ask you if your business, personal property, inventory, and machinery and equipment have been exempted. It's important that you answer these questions each time you send a 411 and that you answer them correctly. Okay, so you got to really read it specifically. Has inventory been exempted by the vote of the town? Has machinery and equipment been exempted by vote of the town? And then if you do in fact tax one or the other, do you assess business personal property based on fair market value or depreciated? If you don't know the answer to that question, then you likely do depreciated. There are only a few towns that do fair market value.
Yep. And this is not something that's going to change from year to year.
Correct.
This is something that was set in motion long before most of you came to this position. It can be brought up for vote to stop taxing the personal property. So in that event, you would change it. But we have seen some instances where these questions are answered incorrectly. So we do want to make sure that we look at them and we do answer them correctly for when we submit our grand list to PBR.
Yep.
Okay.
And so then if you were trying to go through the reconciliation process, what you should see here is a total for all of the exemptions by category. So you could correlate that back to, okay, my current use should be a total of, I don't know, that's a little blurry. Is it 18 million or 16 million? 514,909?
18,514,909. Yes.
Okay, so you should be able to correlate that back. It doesn't have the number of parcels here, but it has the total for each of those categories. So that will correlate to the bottom portion of your 411.
All right. And then the veterans exemption you saw on the front of your 411 that we just showed you. So that number 70,000 should also show up on the front of your 411.
Yep.
Then we have the homestead veterans exemptions beyond 10,000. This 210,000 that shows on your screen represents the amount of assessment that the town is still going to be liable paying to the education tax. That number, along with any other voted contracts in your tab that exempt the education portion, go into what you might have on your tax bill is called local agreement. So if you've seen that before, you're fresh to this job, that is how we come up with that local agreement number.
Quick comment, for East Montpelier, their partial exemption is a senior center that rents apartments.
Okay. Yep, that's a perfect example. Exempt, but for the fact that they're creating a commercial piece by renting out some of it, so that needs to be taxed. That's correct.
Absolutely. And so here we have a sample of the NEMRIC report that will show you your contracts. This part prints as part of your 411. So you should be able to identify this, if this were the case, your single contract, you would be able to identify this exemption on the front of your 411. Anything to add here, Christy?
Yeah, so we didn't really talk about, you can see that this one says grandfathered, and we didn't really talk about that. There are certain types of property that are considered grandfathered, meaning that the legislature said, we will not charge the education tax on these. So the town doesn't need to pick up the tax on these as long as there's a vote in place. And those are things like the fire and rescue properties within your town, okay? And so this is a perfect example. Berkshire Fire Department was voted for a 10-year based on Title 32, 3840. It looks like it needs a revote in this example, right? But that would be considered grandfathered. So the town is not picking up the education portion of that tax. All of the taxpayers in the state of Vermont are. We're considering it exempt for all purposes as long as there's a vote in place with a good date.
Yep. So in that way, it operates just like current use. The taxpayer, the person who owns the property or entity that owns the property, does not pay municipal or education on that, but the rest of the taxpayers in the state of Vermont are picking up the education tab.
Yep.
Yep. All right. And then we have, as we discussed earlier, that non-tax parcel where Christy pointed out at the very bottom of that printed 411, it tells you how many non-tax parcels you have. So this is a report that you'll also see printing with your 411. I believe it prints out of the NEMRIC program, but it certainly prints out of the VT Pi program when we view the 411 there. So you should be able to quantify and identify those parcels.
It does, and you'll also note here, so each one of them has the statute that those things are statutorily exempt according to, in other words, the law. 32 VSA 3802, et cetera, et cetera. So how were you able to say this was non-taxable? That's what that's labeling. And then it has the exempt amount, right? And then it has the countdown at the bottom, and you'll notice that it's 17. That's because on our 411, we had 21. So we must have 4 state-owned parcels. So if we were to go and run the state-owned report, we would be able to reconcile those other 4.
Absolutely. And I believe that when we built the process in the VT Pi program, we are also including that state-owned report that'll print automatically when you print your 411. So it'll be right there for you and you don't have to go run a separate report.
And it's always good to check these every year because let's just say, for example, you inadvertently clicked non-taxable on Sue Smith's property. It would show up here and you could correct it before you print your whole entire grand list. Because of course, Sue Smith, we want her to get her tax bill, right? So we want to make sure that we didn't inadvertently code someone or something non-taxable that should not have been. It's good to review those every year.
Because Sue is certainly not going to call and tell you she didn't get a tax bill. Right. She'll just get a freebie for that year.
So
All right.
Sharon,
Yep, go ahead.
Sharon values her exempt buildings using insurance amounts.
Yep, so the legislature said that these properties are required to file with you what's called an insurance value. So they're required to give you a form. If they didn't, you can ask for it. And you can then use the insured value or the assessed value. You can choose either one. My preference, if you have an assessed value, I would use the assessed value. If you don't, you can rely on the insurance values. The reason I would prefer an assessed value is because I want to know what the value of my entire grand list is in relation to fair market value. So I want to get it as close as possible. And often insurance values are not the same because they do it differently. Their valuation is different.
Absolutely. For those of you who are in the process of or are planning for a reappraisal, particularly with any parcels that have a dwelling. So like I gave the example of the parish that was eventually rented out because the priest or pastor didn't live there anymore. Those are most often the pieces that we see that become taxable. And so even though they may appear as non-taxable and might not be on the radar for you or your contractor, it would be a really good idea to have them do data collection and provide an assessed value on those structures. That way you're prepared when and if the use of that property changes. All right, and we'll do one more slide before we take a quick break. Let's talk about the sample PTTR checklist and how to make sure that you are identifying that you have gone through the motions and crossed all your T's and dotted all your I's. Christy?
So this isn't something that you have to use, but I formatted it a long time ago because there was a group of listers who were brand new elected, had no veterans to rely on, no veteran listers, and they didn't know what to do. So they kind of needed a process for each thing. So it's just a way to kind of keep track of where do all the changes need to happen when a property transfers. Property transfer tax return is a PTTR that you receive from the clerk to say this property is now different. It's owned by somebody else or a portion is owned by somebody else. So there's a lot of pieces that need to happen and things you need to check. So this is just kind of a good way to say, did I check all those things and did I make all the changes that are necessary? You could certainly use it. You could print it out. You could put it with every PTTR. You could check them off as you go. You could use it as a way. I know a town a long time ago made a rubber stamp with this kind of information, and then they put it right on their copy of the PTTR to kind of keep track. It's also useful if there are different listers in the office at different times. You could use it to say, I did this and I checked it. Going forward, that kind of thing, to keep track of where you're at, or you start a PTTR and then you have to walk away and you forget where you're at in the process. Just kind of, a suggestion of how you might keep track of that kind of stuff.
It's definitely a great way to get into the motions of doing this. Um, I personally would probably call this a transfer checklist. Um, I have found towns that do not look at deeds when they process a transfer, go straight from the PTTR and have end up or ended up in worlds of trouble, lots of issues, lots of errors and omissions to fix. So, and keep that in mind. We're not talking just about the PTTR here. We're talking about the entire transfer.
And I think an important part of this too is that the very last piece that says listers review and agree, because we have to remember that we're not doing, if we have a board, we're doing things as a board. So you want to at least get someone else to look at your work and check through it and make sure you all agree on what you've processed.
Yeah, because it really is, it's very common to have only one or two listers in the office doing the bulk of the work, with the second or third listers coming in to set the value. So it's really important to review these and agree. You're a board of three, you must have a majority for all of the changes that you make. So keep that in mind.
Cool. So one of the items on the grand list is the property value itself. This is, it's not something you do every day. You only do it certain times of the year, but it's a big piece of the grand list. And there's a lot involved. You are calculating, assigning, and defending all of the assessed values. You're going to need to learn how to read and understand and articulate the lister's card. That might be called the cost sheet, a property record card. That's that summary page of each property and the details on the property and the elements of the value. You're going to want to learn and understand a data collection form and the data collection process. We're going to talk about that next. Data collection forms are going to be tailored specifically to the software that you use in your town. We call that CAMA software. That stands for Computer Assisted Mass Appraisal. Assisted being the key word there. It's not going to be a calculator. A lot of this inspection work is going to be up to you to understand and interpret and make judgment calls. It's not punch in some data and have it spit out the number and tell folks the computer said your house was worth X. So the data collection form is something you can use in the field to help make sure you get all of the elements needed to help you make that valuation. And as you get better, you will need to use it less because you'll know what you're looking for. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. You're going to need to understand fair market value and its relationship to equity and current assessments. This is a big concept. Basically, your town is frozen in time at the time you've done a reappraisal. So if it's been 6, 7, 8 years since you've done a reappraisal, but you're inspecting a property tomorrow, the value you're coming up with for that property is going to be its fair market value as if you were looking at it 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So if you look at a brand new construction and you know it's selling for $425,000 and your CAMA system and your data collection only gets you $280,000, that's because you have to be stuck frozen in that point in time in the past. You need to maintain equity amongst all the properties in town rather than hit today's current market value. Then, after a certain amount of time, those property values have fallen so far away from what the actual market is doing. You know it's time to do a reappraisal. You reset the bar. You reset the standard. That's a larger topic. We'll get into that ad nauseum in other teachings and other portions of this, I'm sure.
Absolutely. We go into great detail in a 4 full day in-person training that we give for data collection. Some listeners mentioned it earlier yesterday. So I just want to make sure that nobody's panicking. Remember, we do not panic. We might get a little uncomfortable, but then we're going to pick up the phone and we're going to call our DA or our contractor or a senior lister. A lot of folks, particularly early on, will rely on that CAMA program as their calculator. But what we're saying is that you need to enter the information that you collect during the inspection process, print it out, and then for a while you're going to compare it to other like properties to see, did I treat these two properties the same? Right? Because it's going to be really, really hard for you as a new lister, and sometimes not even a new lister, someone who's been there for several years, to kind of put those blinders on and say, okay, I did my reappraisal in 2015. What was the market doing then? I know that this brand new house would probably sell for, say, $500,000 right now in the market, but maybe back in 2015 it was coming through at 3.5 or $350,000. So you can use it as that general calculator, but you always have to go back and do the gut check to compare it to make sure we're being equitable. Is that fair, Benton?
Yeah, and the word comparable is a key one there. You want to compare something you're inspecting today against something that exists in town. Man, this house is just like the Smith's property, on the other side of town. If I've done my job correctly, and they are similar properties and similarly sized acreages, that CAMA value should be relatively similar as well. So looking at the assessed value at the end of your data collection is going to tell you whether you've missed the mark, if something's awry. So yeah, no need to panic.
Is this a good time for a quick question, Benton?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Question, where would you find sales from 2008? So I think that there's maybe a bigger concept there that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, so you're not going to actually look at sale prices from 2008. Say hypothetically 2008 was your last reappraisal. Your entire grand list's assessments, all the appraised values in the grand list, are going to be calibrated based off of sales from 2006, 07, and 08. So that market snapshot is what your grand list is. So you wouldn't need to look at sales. You need to look at comparable assessed values in your town in that instance. Again, large concept. We could spend an hour talking about it, but that's the basic right there. This is an example of a Microsolve property record card. So this may very well be the document that's in the filing cabinet that's available to the public in your lister's office. It's a basic rundown of the elements of the building. In the upper right, we have a copy of the sketch, which we'll be speaking about. That's the footprint of the property, shows the square footage. There's a cost sheet, which is a more detailed layout and shows the calculation of the values. And again, this is specific to Microsolve, which is a NEMRC CAMA program. Your CAMA program could be totally different and look totally different.
All right. I see some activity in the chat, Beth. I'm not sure if they're questions or just comments.
They are pretty much, well, both. So is there a link to the collection card? Is one question.
Yeah.
Can we put that in the chat maybe?
Yeah. So again, specific to your assessing software. So I know we readily have the Microsolve data collection cards available, and we can probably share that, but you'll want to also reach out to the vendor of your software for what they supply, because it is specific to your computer program that you use.
Great.
I can attach the Microsoft one in a minute. I'll go find it.
That's
actually,
go ahead.
You don't need to. If you look on page 47 and 48 of the packet that was emailed to you on Monday, there is a sample right there for you.
Oh, perfect. Way ahead of us.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Deanna's looking out for you, folks.
All right. And how do we assess a brand new house if our reappraisal schedules are 6 to 7 years old? what is fair in this case?
Sure. Fair is knowing that you're not going to hit today's value. Fair
Yep.
is swallowing the frog and hitting a number from 2008, from whatever that hypothetical year of reappraisal was. And that's what I mean when I say you inspect a property and you know there's a comparable property somewhere else. You want that value to be close to the comparable property's value already in your grand list. It's better to be fair than it is to be at today's market value. Because if you hit an inflated value, a current value, that person's paying more than a neighboring property would.
Yeah. We also want to keep in mind too, a part of the process that we're going to talk about is the equalization study. Any of you who have received a tax bill in the past couple of years, it was an adjustment or a change that was made by legislature. If you look on your tax bill in the middle on the right-hand side for the education calculation, you're going to see an adjustment made for your town's common level of appraisal, your CLA. So that number exists on your tax bill as an adjustment to the tax rate instead of having you reappraise properties every single year to be at current fair market value. So if you're looking at a property in my example before, you know, it would sell right now on the market for 500,000, but back at your reappraisal, it was more like 350,000. If you bring them up to that 500,000 for today, they're going to get double whammied. They're going to get the higher assessment and the higher tax rate. So right now we need to focus on your grand list and being equitable and worry about the liability piece on the tax bill, which is an entirely separate discussion. Anything to add there, Benton or Christy?
It's a deep concept. It takes everyone a while to really fully flesh this out in their minds and then be able to articulate it to a taxpayer. But yeah,
I think-
broad stroke.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just broad stroke, be equitable, maintain fairness in your own individual grand list, and know that that equalization study brings the entire town in line with all the other towns in the state.
A couple more things to say here. Jeff recommends a laminated percent complete sheet that can be reviewed. You can review exactly what is done during a construction project with the owner, then no questions later. And question is building square feet based on exterior measurements or interior measurements? Buildings have different thicknesses of walls.
Yep, absolutely. Good questions. We're going to touch on all that. Jeff sounds like an old pro. He's talking about the percent complete sheet. We'll show you that later on too. Let's develop the concept a little further. So up next, we have that data collection sheet, again, tailored specifically in this case to Microsolve. You will have something similar for the specific CAMA or software that you use in your town. This is a way when you're out in the field to make sure you've collected all of the different elements, all the different pieces of information that you may need to develop a value when you're sitting back in the office. Again, as you are more practiced and have more time, your more senior listers may no longer use these. You might walk out into the field with a tape measure and a blank piece of paper. But as you're just starting this journey, it's a great rubric to have. It helps remind you of questions you may want to ask a homeowner while you're inspecting their property, and to make sure you grab all of the specific information you're going to need in the field.
Yep. Again, we teach a whole 4-day class on how to fill this card in and how to actually go through and physically inspect the properties. As a new lister, where I found this very helpful was to pull this out of another parcel. If they exist, some towns don't have them anymore because they've reappraised and their contractors didn't continue on with this methodology. But for me, as a new lister in a reappraisal, I actually took this form and I went through my own house. And then I went through my co-listers' houses or my grandparents' house, and went through and gave it my best shot. And then I came back and looked at what it looked like actually in the system. How did the professionals do it, right? That way I could start to get an idea of how to enter the data, what was considered at the time of reappraisal, again, to maintain that equity, because that is the foremost thing that we need to do as listers and assessors.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So much like the PTTR checklist, we keep a checklist for cost changes. You start by going out and inspecting that property. Then you want to take all that data you've collected in the field and enter it into your appraisal software, your CAMA software. You will need to then generate a new cost sheet or property record card, whatever you keep on hand in your town office. Mind you, for these new inspections, you don't immediately put them into the public record. They don't become the real deal until you've gone through the grievance process. So you want to keep all of the new property inspections, permit work, any new values in a separate file until you've allowed taxpayers to vet that value you've come up with, had the chance to appeal. And after the appeal period ends, the grievance period ends, then they become part of the public lister file.
Benton, can I make a suggestion here?
Yeah, please.
It's always good also to have what I would call a grievance file. So in other words, keep a copy of everything that you changed this year in a file so that you can cross-check your change of appraisal with those. And then you have a way of easily checking to make sure that everybody's getting a notice. So you can keep a copy in their file as well as a separate file of everything that you changed.
Yeah, exactly. So as you go in and you make these changes, you also want to record that value change in the grand list. And NEMRIC has built in a change of appraisal report. So like Christy said, you can run that report and here's every value that's moved over the course of the last year. That's your way to reconcile. Make sure you haven't missed anybody or you inadvertently changed the value of a property that you did not mean to. As you touch the total value of a property, you also need to consider the house site and homestead allocations. That's different elements of the property. So you want to make sure if it is a business use building, that it is declared non-residential or non-homestead. You want to keep an eye on those flags as you go. You want to mark up the old listers file again after the grievance process. I like personally to keep a copy of old listers cards. It's nice to see the evolution over time of a property. But do know that it is old. Mark it up, say, put an X through it. There's a new document in front of that.
Right. Great time to mention again, early yesterday, we talked about open meeting law and public records. Almost everything in your office is considered a public record. There may be some exceptions or some exemptions there that are prescribed by law and can be discussed with the Secretary of State's office for the state archives, or VSARA. VSARA is the acronym for that. I will tell you right off that unless it's a correspondence or a sticky note with something that they call transitory, everything in your office should be kept for 3 years. So once you mark it up, you've created a new lister card. If you've printed one for your file, you can't throw the old one away for 3 years. Okay, just keep that in mind.
Yeah, good point. It's public office, so there is some stringent rules we got to adhere to. And don't forget, you are a board, so you all have to you got to agree on what happens. You got to fight it out amongst each other. So you come up with the value, and you gotta hit that quorum, as it's called.
And again, as Christy mentioned on that PTTR or transfer checklist, it's not required that you do that. We've created these resources for you, particularly as new listers, to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's, hitting all of the things that you need to consider to make sure you've gotten through the entire process on every property and every transfer.
Yeah.
Any questions, Beth?
No, just Christy put the Secretary of State's notice on Archives and Records Administration.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy.
All right. What's next?
I can find my cursor here. We will find out. All right. Inspection process.
Oh yeah, tools of the trade. So, oh no, do these fly in all at once? Perfect. So, clipboard and pencil. I'm a pencil guy because they work when it's below zero, which that unfortunately ends up being when you do some of your data collection work. Bring a couple writing utensils with you. A copy of the cost report and the prior sketch. If you're doing a permit inspection on an existing property, it's nice to have the record in front of you, so it helps you make sense of what has changed. For you to review that document if the taxpayer has any questions about their property record. It's nice to have on you. Luckily, in the modern age, a flashlight and a camera and a calculator are typically always on you in the form of a smartphone. Good to have those things. A 100-foot or a rollout or a surveyor's tape measure, one of the big tape measures for doing barns and commercial buildings. Bring your all-weather gear, because again, it could be mud season, it could be 10 go a percent complete form. I believe there's
Benton, you cut out for just a minute there, so if you could go back like
oh no
10 seconds.
Oh no. So your 100-foot tape measure for the big buildings, your all-weather gear. It's a sunny day. I shouldn't have any trouble with my internet. That data collection card we had talked about. And then a percent complete form, as Jeff had mentioned earlier. I know we have one somewhere in the document and probably coming up in the presentation, but a percent complete form is merely a rubric you can use for a house that's under construction. There's a field in most CAMA programs where you can put in the percent complete of the building, and that helps you value a partially constructed building. 5% for the foundation, another 5% for the windows, and 5% for the roofing, so on and so forth.
Yeah, we will definitely show that on the screen, but it is available also in the back, in the appendix of your document.
Yep, good. And yeah, and we can send you a PDF too, so you can print out 100 of them, keep them in your office. A normal 25-foot carpenter's tape measure, or a laser tape measure, which is a handy tool. Copy of the building permit, so you know what you're looking for. A copy of the property tax map. It's not a survey, and you're not there really to discuss acreage necessarily with the property owner, but it's nice to have a visualization of the lot against its neighboring lots and kind of just get the lay of the land. And a measuring wheel is another alternative to the 100-foot surveyor's tape.
The measuring wheels come in really handy when you're doing barns. There are many barns that are longer than 100 feet. So you don't want to have to measure out 100 feet and then mark your spot and go forward. It's easier to just walk along with those measuring wheels. In my town, we were cheap, so we wouldn't spring for one for the lister's office, but the highway department had one, and the 911 coordinator had one because they had to establish the new addresses as they occurred. So you might not have it specifically for your office, but somebody else might be willing to lend you one.
Speaking of that inter-office collaboration, oftentimes the 911 coordinator is also the zoning person. It might be worth walking across the hallway to the zoning office and doing inspections together in some cases, or at least you want to maintain good communication so they know to furnish you with new building permits as they approve them. You guys got to both know what new activity is going on in town.
Benton, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
Okay, can you take interior photos with permission?
No. I don't know if it's ever written down anywhere as a law, no, but it's bad practice. Remember, you're dealing in public records. So if there's a structural issue, if there's something of note that you need, do it in notes, do it in writing. Don't take interior photos. And if you're taking exterior photos, try to be selective with your angle to keep as much personal property out of the photos as you can. Don't try to get cars and license plates in the photos either. Really try to protect people's privacy as much as you can, because everything you have lives there for perpetuity. So I think that touches on that, unless you got anything to add there, Deanna.
Nope, I think you covered it.
Right. So site visits, pounding the pavement. You're going out and you're inspecting properties. You're making valuations as of April 1st of every year. And as we said earlier, that doesn't mean tie your shoes and run around to every single property on the 1st of April. But if you get to a property on April 10th, could you hit the next couple fly-ins for me? Thank you. If you went and visited a property on April 10th, just have a chat with the builder contractor, say, hey, whereabout were you guys at a week ago when you have your percent complete sheet in front of you? Okay, well, we had the foundation poured, but we didn't have the walls erected last week. We erected the walls this week. Okay, so we're gonna disregard the walls for this year. April 1st is our line in the sand. Every grand list you work on starts on April 1st and ends on March 31st. So that's that. We had to pick a date, and that's the date. And for those partially completed projects, anything that you may have to go back to next year, you need to develop a tracking system. You don't want a property to live in your grand list as partially finished in perpetuity. That's not equitable to everybody else in town. So make sure you go back as many times as needed to see a project completed.
I saw some activity in the chat. I don't know if it's comments or questions, Beth.
Okay, let's see. In Mimi's office, they also share tools. And Todd mentions online websites that have the ability to measure from aerial views are Vermont Parcel Viewer and the Vermont Natural Resources Atlas, which is fantastic. Those have the ability to measure as well.
I absolutely agree. Use all of the tools that are available to you. As new listers, we try and instill the importance of being able to look in person at a structure and be able to measure and do those things, right? That's the basis for everything we do. As we get better at this process, we can start to incorporate some of those other tools. With the aerial images, I did also have a town get in trouble by using just the aerial measurement and not seeing the property. And it just happened that a third of a structure happened to be a lean-to and carried a different value than assuming the entire thing was a completely furnished or finished garage. So in our opinion, it's always good to put eyes on the property, even if you can't get inside. Christy or Benton?
Yeah, I just want to throw in there, you got to be as thorough as you can. So you're always going to attempt to lay eyes on a property. You're putting a value on it. It's only fair to everybody involved that you actually see what you're valuing. That being said, there's plenty of folks who don't want you to be there, and they have every right to deny you access to their property. In which case, the best tool available to you is using a measurement from a satellite image. You have no other option, and you need something to get the data that's required to develop a value. So yeah, by all means, know all the tools and use them appropriately.
And it seems like those tools get better, every year, sometimes, every month. So it's good to be familiar with the process and then learn those extra tools that can make your life easier as you go. Thank you,
Absolutely.
Todd.
Yep. And I think I would add, I'll die on the hill on this one, but I think I would add, even if you're using aerial photos to get your measurements and so forth, there's nothing like, even if you step foot on the ground that you can get on at the curb and look and know that you've seen that property, best case scenario, right? You have more knowledge just by having been there. If you can take a walk around, even better. If you can do some hand measurements to check, even better still. And better yet is if folks will let you in.
Yep. My example in my town, there has been a gorgeously finished on the inside house that has had the Typar reapplied 5 times because somewhere along the lines they were told that once they put the siding on the property, their value would go up. Just a drive-by doesn't give you that information. And certainly aerial photography is not going to give you that information, but just one of the many ways that what is on the outside of a property can be really deceiving of what is on the inside.
Do we have time for a few more questions?
Yeah, while we're on the topic, let's go through it.
Sure, great. So Lewis's comment is there's a search function in NEMRIC for percent complete. Question, what about houses that people are working on but take years to complete as they just can't afford to finish it?
That's a common one. I did a lot of data collection work before I came to PVR, and there's what I called the frequent flyers. Some people, willingly kept the 3 pieces of trim off, thinking that was going to save them in the long run from this big wallop of a tax bill. And there are people who just are doing it slowly. The mechanic's car never runs and the carpenter's house is never finished. There is a point where maybe it's appropriate for you to make a judgment call where instead of a house being 100% complete, maybe it just lives, maybe it's as done as it's ever going to be, and it would be appropriate to take it off your reinspection list. It's not going to move. Or maybe you can manipulate one of the other data points. We won't get too far into the weeds. This is a data collection specific sort of topic, but we have a quality grade. So instead of a higher quality home that's less than 100% complete, potentially you could say you have a lower quality home that is 100% complete. There's a bunch of different ways to tackle that issue, but bottom line is these tools are not a calculator. You'll have to have some nuance in manipulating that data, and some properties are just never finished, especially in Vermont.
Thank you. If we accidentally get someone's car/license plate in the photo, should we blur that out or leave the photo as is?
Gosh, I don't know. Luckily, I'd say the photos are relatively low resolution. What do you think, Deanna?
I was going to say, with today's technology, you could blur it out or you could crop it out. I see
Yep.
Christy unmuted as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're able and you notice it, yeah, blur it out, but don't go back and check them all. I wouldn't worry about it that much.
Okay, we have a property in our town that is showing that it is not 100% complete. The property owner feels it shouldn't be marked as 100% as it has no water or electric, although he uses it as a camp and doesn't intend to do any further improvements. He has not authorized us to move to 100%. Thoughts?
Yeah, remember the mainstay question you're answering is what is the fair market value? So really all of the data points come down to semantics. Some people just read the data collection card and want it to say certain things. At the end of the day, what you care about is if a sign was stuck in the ground, what would that property transact for? What's it worth in the open market? So camp versus dwelling, there's a lot in that topic alone. You just kind of have to let people say their piece and then know what's asked of you as a lister with that fair market value piece and balance those two.
Great.
And as Benton alluded to a moment ago, there are caveats for the quality and the condition of the construction. So if it's a camp construction,
Mm-hmm.
the cost tables that are in the background of your CAMA system are not going to match the same as they would for a residential construction, or say a one-story ranch versus a one-story camp. If you
Yep.
put in all of the same attributes and you call one a ranch and one a camp, those cost reports are not going to match, because there are some assumptions that are made based on the type of construction. Again, this is an extensive topic in our data collection class. But I would say one thing that worried me a little bit on that was that the taxpayer has not authorized the listers to put it at
Mm.
100%. And I think that's a very, very dangerous place to be. They have the ability to appeal their value with you, but they do not have the ability to change how you capture that data.
Yeah, it's
Christy?
not up to them.
Agreed. And are you going to talk about the percent complete form, Benton? So I should not bring it up now, or should I?
It's been brought up a few times. I don't
Okay.
know where exactly it pops up in our presentation. I
It's-
know it's in the document.
It's in
I
the
did
very back
touch
of the
on it.
document.
It's
So-
Yep.
also on page 21 of our, it's coming up in a couple of pages.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll leave it alone then.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, whoop,
No, go
more
for it, Beth.
questions? Okay, thanks. How about gathering information from multiple listings about the property, MLS listings, sorry. Is there any issue with doing this? I had property owners who have denied access to the property try to say I couldn't use the MLS listing information.
It's public
Sure.
information.
Yeah, and if it's the only piece of information you got, if they're not going to let you inside, then it's all you can use. The only word of caution I give is don't lean on that as your only tool, because then you're only capturing fresh data on properties that sell, and your job is to be equitable for everyone.
Right.
Not just targeting folks. But if no one's letting you in and there's a fully finished basement and a listing photo, that's the best you got to go on. It's just like using the satellite imagery. You
Right.
got to use it.
And
So-
I would argue you have an obligation. If you find out, for however you find out, you have an obligation to change it, because that's what you're charged with, right? I know this is no longer the fair market value because now they finished off that entire basement. So I need to adjust it accordingly.
Yep.
Comment from Todd, Google Street View can have some good views, but yes, the online data is most likely dated, so eyes on is best advice. Question, what if the owner has no permit on a garage which appears to have an apartment and will not let you on property? How do you estimate what is inside?
Judgment call. You gotta make the call. You own this at the end of the day as the listers.
If
Yep.
it walks like a duck, treat it like a duck. I would say
Yeah.
if you think it's an apartment, you're going to put it in as an apartment. They're going to get a chance to grieve, and you can say, "Would you like me to come out next week?"
And there's telltale signs. There's usually a plumbing vent stack. There's usually, some sort of heat exhaust port somewhere, whether for a Rinnai heater or a chimney. You can tell. A lot of times you can tell, it's a judgment call.
So Mimi states our new camera program has an interior exterior field. You can see if they match.
Interesting. So that's the Patriot product for those of you who might be using Patriot or Assess Pro. Again, every CAMA program is going to be a little bit different. I think it's still around 75-ish% of the state that uses Microsolve. So that's why we focus our trainings to the Microsoft product. We get the biggest bang for our buck there. But I would certainly discuss that with your CAMA provider on how to do those types of comparisons. Good point, Mimi.
Jed asks, how do we know that aerial photos are current to today?
There might be a timestamp on it, but I don't think you can truly. I would assume they're at least a year old in most cases.
In my experience, there is a timestamp, and it's not always accurate from having looked at my own property and seen an old car there with a timestamp of a newer date.
Ah,
So,
see,
yeah,
there you
it's
go.
a little sloppy. Yeah. Let's see. Al mentions treat with condition, not quality or percent complete. That's another way
Oh,
of.
okay. Yeah. I've collected a lot of data with Al and he's right there. And you can argue back and forth depending on what exactly you're trying to get to for an end result. Remember, you need to be sussing out the market value.
I,
But yeah,
I
if there's
think
a
I think what Al might be talking about there is that one with the camp situation. But as a general rule, if you have something that's not complete, I think you're going to be best to use that percent complete for tracking purposes, right? So that we'll be able to go back year after year. I
Mhm.
think what Al might be referring to is the one that's endless and they're never gonna finish the project.
right, right. Yeah, in which case all the data points are malleable, so adjust them
Mm-hmm.
all as necessary to get where you're
Mm-hmm.
going at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah.
And remember that an average quality house might be an excellent quality camp or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
we always have to focus on the structure that we're assessing and what quality and condition applies to that structure. So,
Yep.
And not the use, because there can be $1 million house on the
Mhm.
lake that is referred to by the owners as their camp, and that's fine,
Mhm.
but it is not a camp.
Right.
Again, 4-day course. We can talk about this ad nauseum in person later this year.
Yeah, great. Chris from Nemrick mentions in reference to license plates, there's a reason things are blurred when you look at Google Maps. Keep
There you
people,
go.
animals, personal property out of your pics. Personal property can be very tricky.
Yep.
In reappraisal, do they let you onto the property to measure the outside of the house?
Do they have to let you? They don't have to let you know.
Okay.
If certainly if there is a sign that says, posted, do not trespass, et cetera, then stay away, stay at the street. If there's no sign, you could certainly go up and look around and knock on the door and ask for permission. If at that point they tell you to get off, you politely exit the scene.
For
Due to
your
the price of
safety, I would.
ammunition, there'll be no warning shot.
I was just gonna say,
Okay.
for your safety, I would definitely knock first and then look around.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
you don't want to be caught in someone's backyard if they haven't heard you knock.
And
Common
and
sense
and
is
the,
king.
and the mailer, the I know people have their opinions about the note card on the door, but because everyone has Ring cameras now, it's probably a good idea for that purpose because they're going to see you, and if they don't know who you are, it would be better for them to have some reference.
Great. Comment from Jeff, especially to protect your sales study if you find a major change prior or after the sale. That's a comment disconnected from what I can
Mhm.
find up above. Sorry about that. Let's see, Jed, all these problems with property owners let them go to BCA, they have to let the BCA in or they lose their appeal.
That is true.
Yep.
How about assumed condition for interiors when not allowed in? In most towns, no permit is required, so many owners will not want to allow you in after renovations. It seems like the assumption we should make is that it's high grade. If they grieve, are they required to then let you in?
Oh, this is
Judgment
a
call
fun
on your
one.
part.
Right.
You
They're never
get
required to let the listers in, is the bottom line. Okay. But I would assume it's as good as what you can see. I would not go crazy with it, but it's certainly as good as what you can see.
I have certainly heard kind of old guard lister practices long ago and hopefully far removed, where kind of like trying to stick it to them in order to force an entry at the time of grievance. It's not best practice and it's not going to look very good on you if that goes to appeal and beyond. Um, we want to be fair, we want to be equitable with the information that we have. We can make some reasonable assumptions based on what we know and go from there.
Great. Last
Absolutely.
comment. Timestamps can be confusing. They can give a recent date for publishing older data.
Absolutely.
That's it.
All right. Great
Hi.
questions, everyone, and comments. Thanks. All right, moving on to the inspection preparation.
Okay. As we mentioned, take data collection. That's a 4-day course that we teach, and we touch a lot of topics in there, everything we've been discussing and more. Develop that inspection routine with your veteran listers. Recheck and track incomplete properties. This is a big one. Marshall and Swift. That is a company which develops replacement cost figures, which we use as a standardization loaded into the CAMA software. So it creates a backbone. We call them the cost tables. For the calculation of that assessed value in the CAMA software. It's specific to our region. It's specific to a date and time. Your cost tables from Marshall and Swift are updated at the time of reappraisal. It's a skeleton in the background that we use. We'll refer to it quite a bit, but that's the main thrust of that.
It may also be a black manual, a smaller manual that you find kicking around your office based on the time of your last reappraisal. It used to be very common for the town or the reappraisal contractor to provide that at the time of reappraisal, so that you could actually look in that book and then look at a printout of a cost report and identify where those values were coming from. I know that it's a little less typical now, and I don't think any of the contractors themselves provide it, but it's certainly a tool that you could look into getting. And I think there's actually a picture of the small desktop copy on page 17, as well as the larger copy for commercial purposes.
Yeah. Great reference to take out in the field. You're looking at a new outbuilding that was built and you don't know what exactly to call it. There's photos, there's a lot of reference points in those manuals to help you determine what you want to do, how you want to call a certain building for value purposes. All those tools we discussed earlier, bring your waders and your tape measure. Transparency, definitely nice to have a name tag, knock on the door, have a sign on your vehicle. You know, you want to make your presence known. You don't want to be sneaking up on properties. You want people to know why you're there. If at all possible, especially in permit season, try to make appointments whenever you can. Be transparent. In practice, don't let the first house you collect data on be a taxpayer's. Maybe it'd be better to start with town hall or your own house, your neighbor's house, a fellow lister's house. Get practice with one of those data collection cards, knowing what to look for, how to run the tape measure. You wanna not look like a total amateur the first time you go out, just for credibility's sake.
And I know everyone in the state is looking at a reappraisal, or most people are looking at a reappraisal in the next few years, 2, 3, 5 years. My suggestion, which might be to the dismay of most reappraisal contractors, is get on the road with them. Go to, say, 10% of the properties with them, do your own data collection, and then compare it to what they've done. That's how you're really going to get the biggest bang for your buck in understanding how to maintain that equity going forward.
Yep, that's a good point. You want to learn how to use the software that's being calibrated by them while they're doing the reappraisal. You want to be able to continue to drive that train after they leave. Yep, practice makes perfect.
All right,
All right.
talking about measuring.
Yeah. So, the basis for how our systems develop a value is a market adjusted replacement cost. So market adjusted, meaning we're looking at sales throughout a period of time during that reappraisal to calibrate the system. And then it's based off of dollar per square foot figures for different material types, qualities of construction, the condition the property's in. But it's a replacement cost similar to like an insurance company would use. So because of that, We are measuring the outside of the building. We want to know how much of a certain type of material is involved in this. That's a question taxpayers raise because they go, wait a second, we're talking about square footage. A realtor wants to know how big the interior of a room is for their listing, for their advertising. You need to know the exterior. Someone had mentioned the thickness of walls earlier in our conversation. Different qualities of construction assume different thicknesses of walls, and there's ways to adjust for all nuance of different types of construction in the system. You'll get better at that the more you do it. You can manipulate the software to reflect exactly what you see in reality. So,
And I think the answer you can give to that question when it comes up, Benton, is that it's industry standard to data collect from the outside as far as measurements.
yeah, this is what we do.
Right, not to say that you might not need to measure something on the inside if something's unfinished or to make an adjustment for cathedral space or something like that. But as far as your total square footage, you're going to start with the outside and its exterior measurements, regardless of the thickness of the wall.
Yeah. You're
Absolutely.
dealing with the construction material, not the living space necessarily. I mean, the living space is part of it, but sketch the perimeter, record dimensions. I briefly showed you that sketch on the property record card. We're going to talk about that some more. But that's the perimeter of the exterior of the building. And like Christy said, if you're dealing with a property and it's hanging off of a cliff, you can't walk around the other side of it. Some things you're going to have to measure from the inside. You'll have to get creative to close the shape to get yourself all the way around the building in terms of measuring. And we're going to discuss that a little bit in the following slides. So, finished living area. It's intended for human occupancy. It's meant to be lived in. What that means is typically it is conditioned space. It's heated or cooled or both. There's generally accepted interior construction. Now, some people think a well-polished plywood floor is perfectly acceptable, and it is. Some people think mahogany is better, and it might be. You can manipulate those points through other means, quality, condition. There's other ways to get that, but generally accepted interior construction, 4 walls, has some sort of flooring, some sort of wall covering, some sort of insulation, power, if we're feeling ritzy, electricity. It differs from a shed, essentially. And anything less than that generally accepted interior construction can be considered an unfinished area, workshops, attached sheds, what have you. That's just a real rough explanation of the differences. Most of us get it when we see it. There are special circumstances. We have a concept of the usable space. So older homes with really low roof lines. If you're on the second floor and the slope of the roof is impinging on the square footage upstairs, we need to make an adjustment for that. The usable space is generally accepted to be somewhere between 4 and 5 feet. That's a standard by IAAO. When I was collecting data, would use the height of my shoulder, where my shoulder hit the wall to perpendicular across that room. That would be the width I'd use. So if a house is 20 feet tall, but the ceilings are sloped, maybe the second floor is really usably 16 feet tall. It's a concept we get into further as we go. And then you need to account for cathedral open foyers. You need to remove second floor area where it doesn't exist from the footprint of the first floor. And we'll show an example of that later on too.
So quick comment here for those buildings that have cathedral spaces or open space and you don't get inside, right? Another thing that we really need for you to remember as part of the inspection process is as listers and assessors, we do not look in windows. So it's very possible that you might miss some of these scenarios, right? We're going to go ahead and send that change of appraisal notice. We'll tell them why we changed their appraisal, and then they have the opportunity to bring that information to you. If it is, say, an 1800s house that you can clearly see that the roof line comes down and almost touches the trim of the upstairs window. Most windows are, 3 to 4 feet high. You can assume that there is some space that's lost up there. So there are some exterior pieces that might clue you in, but it might really just be that you have to wait until you can have that conversation with the taxpayer if they're not there at the time of the inspection.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Deanna says, there's room for the grievance process, and your records are inspectable by the public. So folks can vet this information and work to correct it if needed. You just got to do the best you can.
All right, before we move on to calculating livable space, do we have any questions or comments in the chat, Beth?
We do. Comment, wastewater permits can shed some light on number of bathrooms.
Yeah.
Let's see. Lewis says, I encourage homeowners not to leave anything to my imagination.
Yep.
And then let's see, Carol, it used to be that if the grievance went to BCA, Board of Civil Authority, the Board of Civil Authority could inspect, ? Has that changed?
Nope,
Christy
that's
writes,
still the same. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, you don't have to let the listers in if they choose not to.
Yeah, so there's a 3-party inspection committee at the time of Board of Civil Authority. So they've gone to the listers, they've grieved, they still don't like the result of what the lister said. They can go to the Board of Civil Authority, which I think we talk about later. And even at that point, even though 3 BCA members are required to be allowed through the structure, they can request that a lister can join them, but it's not required.
Thank you. Do different CAMA programs use the Marshall and Swift calculations?
Yep, and I think Christy answered that most do, or some variation thereof. Yep.
When
just
doing
needs
barn,
the backbone of that industry standard. That's the real piece. It needs to be, backed by something.
right. When doing barns, if used for animals, is that going to be different from general purpose barn? Does it change value if put differently? I think there is a cattle barn. To put it differently,
Type of construction matters more than the use. There are, in Marshall and Swift specifically, there's several different types of farm outbuildings. So you want to find the description of the building type by construction, which somewhat dictates its use in most cases. But no, if there's a barn, 2 barns next to each other, and one is full of boats, then they
you cut out there, but I think you said one is full of boats and the other one is full of pigs.
Yep.
Okay.
The data you're collecting is the same on those 2. Now, the pigs might have a little bit more wear and tear, so that's a condition issue.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I would just bring up that your CAMA program, particularly in Microsolve, because that's what we're familiar with, you might have, when you look at it, you might have 1 barn, but on your cost report, when you print it out, you might have 2, 3, 4 different items in the outbuilding, because the system was built in a way that recognizes values for different construction and different purpose. So you might have a 300-foot barn that captures the value for the first floor. That barn might also have a hayloft, so you may see a hayloft there if it adds value. It may also have an attached milk house or a lean-to to park the trailer under, and you're going to be adding all of those pieces together to get the overall value of the barn. And just another plug for our data collection class. Benton, I don't know if we really believed each other that we would come out with the same answer, but we actually went through the practice of valuing the 5 separate pieces and then having Benton as a more experienced data collector who used to work with a reappraisal contractor value the entire thing as one structure. And I think we came into within like 2 to 3%. So you're still going to get the same value, right? That's the important piece. We need the value for the assessment. How you get there is less concerning than the overall value itself. Anything to add there, Benton or Christy?
In your data collection, again, the public can review their property record cards and anybody else's. So you want it to make sense. You want it to reflect reality, and then again, keep in the back of your mind the biggest piece of that is the fair market value. Make sure the number's right at the bottom of the page.
Great. Question, should the BCA also follow our rules regarding interior photos?
Yeah, I think so. Deanna?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if there was any special dispensation for them.
Nope.
I've never been in a situation where the BCA inspection committee took photos. They're there to review the property and to take into consideration the evidence and the testimony that was provided by the taxpayer, but also the listers that have defended their concept or their estimate of fair market value. They're not there to do data collection. We would never presume that they would be assessment officials. They're there to make sure that what was said was accurate and see if there's any evidence to support the taxpayer's claim of what they believe is different from the listers.
What records from the BCA would be included in the landowner's file?
The BCA records will be kept separate. Those decisions themselves are kept as an addendum to that year's grand list in the clerk's vault. As far as the records that might have occurred during the process, that is not for you. That is for the clerk of the BCA, who was likely the select board chair or the town clerk. So I would push that one off to them. And if they have questions, they can reach out to VLCT, to the Secretary of State's office, and in some cases to a district advisor who might have been part of the process before.
Right. Is there a best practice for rounding inches to feet?
I think industry standard is 6 inches.
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so rounding up or rounding down? At 6.
Round down, benefit, err
Right.
on the side of the taxpayer. It just causes less arguments.
Do we then need to keep a Marshall and Swift book up to date? It costs a lot each year to update.
No.
Only as far as your reappraisal year.
Yeah. Don't pay for the updates each year.
Okay.
You want to get it at the time of the reappraisal and try to get the costs that are the closest to what you're using, so you can speak to your contractor about that, right? And then you're going to keep that in place because that's the closest to what's behind the scenes for you. So you want that to be static until your next reappraisal.
Okay. When they will get an update.
Correct.
They will get an updated Marshall and Swift.
Yeah, they'll
Okay.
have to buy one, but yes.
Yeah, it's on you to buy the book.
Okay, exterior measuring. Do you round to the nearest foot or nearest half foot?
Half foot.
Half foot. Yep.
Right. That was the last question.
All right. We're going to try and barrel through the next 12 minutes because we do have a few more slides we want to finish up by the end of the day, and happy to stay after for questions unless they're really pertinent to what we're talking about in the moment.
And
I'm
remember,
gonna
folks,
back up a
4-day
second.
course.
I'm going to back up a second, folks. We don't round to a half foot. We round to the nearest foot.
Oh, okay. I thought industry standard did have the half foot. I'm mistaken.
Right? You're not going to put 20.5 or 20.6 feet. You're going to either 20 or 21 feet on a measurement.
Yeah.
You're never going to,
okay.
you're not going to put halves.
Sure. And then in that case, round down.
Well,
One-
if it's, yeah, so if you're at 6 inches out of a foot, we're going to round. Or
I
six,
round
I'm sorry.
up. Benton says he rounds down, so be consistent.
There
Yeah,
you go. Be
there's your
consistent.
answer. I say that because then I don't have to argue when someone says it's 6 foot 6 inches or 6 foot 9 inches. All right, I'm calling it 6 foot instead of 7 feet.
Yeah, and let's be honest, nobody's that good. You're gonna see
No,
that on a architectural drawing, of course, but we're gonna do the closest foot.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure,
Great.
sure. Be
Okay.
consistent.
Yeah, Charlotte in Dummerston said that their reappraisers did full feet. If a lister accompanies the BCA, can those observations then be added to the cost sheet?
They can be added to the cost sheet for the following year because we've already lodged our grand list. Unless you go through the process of errors and omission, that could get sticky. The
Mhm.
BCA is going to set a value that's going to be good for one tax year. If they go further to a state appeal, the hearing officer or court, those decisions are good for 3 years, an entirely different topic. But once you get to the point of BCA, we've already lodged a grand list. So we would consider that for the following.
Right, so if I were that lister and we were reconvening with the BCA, I would ask to be heard and say, I would like to note for the record that there was not a deck on the property at our last inspection, and we believe that should be part of the BCA's decision because the BCA can go up, remain the same, or go down. So they need to really reflect what the property is. So my opinion is that we should add that deck at X number of dollars, and I would present that as part of the evidence.
Absolutely. But it has to be part of the BCA's decision at that point. So bring the
Correct.
evidence forward, bring the number forward of how it would cost out in your program if you have that information,
Yep.
and see where the chips fall.
Yep.
That's it. I mean it.
All right. So going back talking about that finished living area, determining what is and what isn't living space, because there is a difference in that dollar per square foot Marshall and Swift replacement cost value. You have to make that judgment call on what is and what isn't meeting the threshold of finished space. Garage, poured concrete floor, exposed studs, maybe insulated, maybe not, unfinished. The entire living space, as we can see here on the left, all heated and finished. That's pretty cut and dry. Okay, now we have a utility room. It's got a furnace and a water heater in it. Okay, but it also has sheetrock, insulation, flooring. It's heated. That's finished space because it
Benton,
has
I
all of
can't
those
use it.
construction elements in it. Well, it does house things that you do use pretty often, your water heater and your furnace.
That's right.
We're doing that replacement cost thing. So we need to account for all the material being used to build that room. And a thing to consider in that is also how you access that space. You know, it's finished space being accessed through finished space. There's an argument for considering it finished space. Now, if it was unheated and you could only get into there through the garage, or maybe it also had the same poured concrete floor as the garage, okay, maybe it's closer to unfinished space. It's one of the many judgment calls you make as a lister. All right, inspection process, combination shapes. Folks, you got to brush up on your geometry for this job. We're trying to find square footages for property. Not all houses are squares or rectangles, especially in Vermont. We got our geodesic domes and plenty of interesting shaped homes. Chopping up a property into smaller shapes that you can get the square footage of will help you determine the total square footage. Of course, just like in math class in high school and college, we have a calculator, but you want to know how to do it without the calculator too. You need to know the basics: length times width, 1/2 base times height on a triangle, pi r squared for a circle.
And
On the
as you
next-
become more familiar with the systems that are available to you, every CAMA program has a sketch program or is able to interface with a sketch program that will do a lot of the math for you, but you need to know how to use that process or that product. I believe that there is for the Microsoft Apex Sketch program. I believe that the Nemrick website does have a full webinar on the basics on how to run that program. So definitely familiarize yourself with that unless you really, really enjoy doing the math. Which some of us do, some of us don't. It's also a good self-check too.
Yep. It's practice. You'll get better as you use it. And if you pop to the next slide, you can take a complex shape and break it up into smaller bite-sized pieces and work your way into the total square footage. So if you don't know how to find the area of an octagon, break it into squares, rectangles, and triangles. You can get your way to the end by breaking a shape up into pieces. It helps to be able to think spatially while doing this work. And as you use your sketching software more, you'll learn what it needs to know, and you'll know where to take measurements in order to feed it the information it needs. You'll learn as you go. Next slide, we have a example of a sketch from Apex, which is the software in Microsoft, which many towns use. Note that the first floor and the second floor oftentimes are not the same square footage in a house. There are one-story portions of a property. That's where we're talking about knowing the slope of the ceiling, knowing if there's cathedral area or open story area. You need to be cognizant of this as you're doing your measurements. Get visual cues from the outside. If property owners are home and allow you inside, take measurements of that negative space, know where the cathedral area is so you can remove that from the second floor. This becomes second nature the more you do it. I think we got a quick quiz. Oh, there you go. First floor is
In the interest of time.
1836. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. So we're just showing you that the number on your sketch for the first floor is 1,836 square feet. In the second floor overlay, you may see this in your system actually overlaid on this bottom floor, or at least as like a shadow to show where it is. But that second floor represents 730 square feet. So you have a total of 2,566 square feet of living area. We're excluding the garage and the second garage that is detached.
They're separate figures because they're separate finish levels, therefore a different dollar per square foot.
Right.
So quick quiz. Certain properties you can't get all the way around the perimeter of a property. You might need to figure out what a length is by power of deduction.
Yep. So on
So-
this sketch, it looks like we might be missing the length of this section here. But we can deduce what that length is by taking the 30 square feet from the far end of the property and then considering the 16 feet that we could see on this side of the property.
Ta-da.
Yep. And then the second measurement that we're missing is the length of that first story with the crawl space. We have a full 52 feet, and on the back of the building, we see a 24 foot measurement for the 2-story and full basement. So 52 minus 24 is that 28 feet difference.
Know what you need. That's where practicing this data collection comes in handy.
Yep. And then we give you some measurements here. And in the interest of time, we're not going to make you do out the math. So I don't know if you want to jot any of that down. This example is actually not in your document, but we're just giving you an exercise to get familiar with calculating those out.
Yeah. Basic square footages.
All right. And then last but not least, we also have a deck, definitely not least. Okay, we've heard about this several times, but the reinspection schedule and percent complete form, again, the entirety is in the back of your documents. If you want to start using this in the field, it's there for you. Anything that we haven't covered on the percent complete, Benson and Christie?
It's a great rubric. If you were looking at a partially constructed property, it ends up being a judgment call by you to apply this percentage. If you use this rubric, it's actually fairly true to reality. I've been a construction worker. I think this is pretty good. Many true construction workers like it, and it gives you something to fall back on. Here's a standard that we use.
And this is straight out of the Marshall and Swift cost manual. So it is based on actual construction percentages. And we made up this grid so that you could use it in multiple years. Again, going out there on April 1st to see where exactly they are on April 1st, and then the following year where they are. So you can use it in as many as 4 years while they complete the project.
Yep. Don't have to use it, but it's a good tool.
All right, so
Okay.
that is where we were hoping to end the day. We got there just in the nick of time. But certainly if there are any questions or other conversation that folks would like to hang out for, I'm sure we would all be happy to stay, or at least a few of us.
Sure.
We do have a couple of comments and questions in the chat. Steve mentions if that garage, that unfinished garage, has no sheetrock, that is a serious code and safety violation.
Sure.
Oh,
We don't wade into code enforcement specifically as listers, but an element to consider and value.
Bringing us to the next question, what's considered a finished garage?
I have been in a few choice properties that had pretty extensive car collections. So it is a garage insofar as the use is there's cars parked in it, but it resembled the Taj Mahal. So it comes down to the quality. What is the dollar per square foot contributing to this property? You can wade as far in the weeds as you want.
Right.
that.
And most of your CAMA systems, you will charge for the structure itself, and then you will build an additional layer on top of that for finish, which has several variations. So you'd learn more about that in data collection class, but that's probably where I would go with that.
Yeah, it's common to have finished space above the first floor, which is the garage, and that's really what the CAMA systems are set up for typically.
Okay, I personally want to go to back to Steve, sort of a finished garage. Does it necessarily have sheetrock?
He's saying for fire code specifically.
I guess I mean for our CAMA system, would you consider a garage without sheetrock finished? Can a garage be finished without sheetrock?
Absolutely. That's fairly typical construction.
Yep. And so I want to make sure we're not confusing the term finished with complete, right?
Right.
So if the structure itself is complete, but on the inside wall of that garage, you're seeing the studs and no insulation, it's not going to be a finished space,
right,
for assessment purposes.
Perfect. Thank you.
But it will be 100% complete, most likely.
Yes.
Okay. I have a walkout basement that has partial sheetrock and foundation walls exposed. There is baseboard heat in the main area and pellet stove in another part. Would these parts be considered finished?
The Microsoft CAMA system, and I imagine it to be true for the other CAMA systems, have a few different grades of finish in a basement, from very rudimentary, and Microsoft is called minimal, up to finished as well as fully as the first and second floor living spaces would be. That's called partition. Where you fall on that spectrum is up to the listers. So that could be minimally finished basement space potentially.
Yep. If you're unsure and you're doing this for the first time, I would look at someone else's house that might have similar construction. If you're at the time of reappraisal, ask your reappraisal contractor how they are valuing that and how they're coding that in the system so you can maintain that equity.
Okay, using percent complete, you have to know what the finished house will be, or you can get a minus value.
I think that's a great point. And what we would want to do is, if it were me, I would want to stand with the property owner and ask all of those questions so I can get the best estimate possible for what that property will be when it's done, understanding that it might change, right? But I'm going to give it the best estimate I can as if it were complete, and then back off the percent complete. It's going to be your most accurate way to do it.
And I think it's important to also note there that if you're using the percent complete, you must know with pretty good certainty what the whole thing is going to be. Otherwise, you might say, well, for my purpose, this would only be a half of a house, but for their purpose, it's going to be the entire house. So we don't want to get into the position where we're discounting the value and then applying a percent complete,
Right.
because then they're going to get a duplicate
Right.
reduction.
Ask all the questions. What's the roof going to be? What's the walls going to be? What's the flooring going to be? Right?
Yep. And if you're not in a position where you can have that conversation, then you can't really consider percent complete unless, you only have 3 walls up and you can see what actually exists there without having the property owner there. So you want to be very careful not to be doing that double dip, so to speak.
Great. What grade would you give to a new manufactured double wide? Excellent, average, fair?
That's got a
The
whole
double
lot of
wide-
depends.
Yeah,
That's a
the
whole-
double wide is placed on a foundation.
That's a whole lot of depends. So it depends whether you're using a single family schedule, depends whether you're using mobile home schedule, depends what the quality I see of the structure itself is. So I can't answer that without seeing it, honestly.
Yep.
Like we
And-
said earlier with that no trespassing sign, if I can't lay eyes on it, I can't make that call, or it makes it a lot harder.
Yeah, and unless it's the first mobile home or double wide that's in your town, go to look at the other cost report.
Yep.
What was that mobile home that was valued in 2015, a 2015 model of a comparable quality and design, then you would want to use the same methodology that was used on that one. Even though it's 10 years newer, right? We're still trying to capture the value from the last reappraisal.
Perfect. If using the percent complete, then bathrooms and kitchen are included in the price?
I think it's captured via plumbing fixtures.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yep.
yes.
Don't put in as no siding, then put in a percent complete regarding the siding. Just an
Correct.
example.
Correct.
Exactly.
Because then you'd
Yep.
be double minusing.
Back to the double wide, it's a single family, not a mobile home. What is the quality of those manufactured houses?
Manufactured specifically means mobile home colloquially. What are the spec houses called? I'm having a brain fart.
Prefab, modular.
Yeah, modular home would be considered single family for the system's purposes.
Mhm.
There's the distinction there. And the quality can vary widely on either of those types of building.
Right. If you're, Natasha, if you're using a single family for a double wide, it most likely is going to be a little bit less than average to start with, but you've got to really look at what they've got. Because you're using a single family as comparison, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions in the chat.
Okay. Hey,
All
pretty
right.
good timing. Thanks, folks.